Today's video is going to be about hearing what you play. It's a follow-up to part 1, and we're going to take the ideas we discussed in that video a little bit further today. My name's Joshua Hatcher. I'm the head of Woodwinds here at Jazz Music Institute. At JMI, we want to help you harness your musical ideas and to feel confident and authentic in expressing them. Last time in part 1 of this series, we talked about knowing your major scale and the importance of audiation, which is where we understand and assign meaning to a sound and then are able to produce that sound. We talked through some exercises such as some scale patterns, like scales in thirds, so forth. Scales playing through triads. And some other patterns like that. All of these exercises were designed to help you know your key center really, really well and know the individual degrees of the scale that outlines and exemplifies the key center. In today's video, we're going to keep talking about relative pitch, but we're going to take it one step further than what we discussed in part 1. Part 1's approach was talking about relative pitch in relation to the tonic. So we worked on ideas like exploring the key center with different intervals, always in relation to the tonic, such as so forth through the key center. Always thinking about finding an interval in relation to the tonic. Now, when we talk about relative pitch, we're talking about relationships. The important thing about relationships is they're about connections and about proportions. So specifically in relation to our key center, the proportions are distances from the tonic. As we go up the scale, the intervals expand and the proportions get increasingly larger as we go up the scale. Now, as we get further and further up the scale and our intervals get wider and wider, in some senses there's more and more margin for error. One approach that I find really useful for perhaps decreasing that margin for error in terms of identifying the intervals you're working with is to talk about other sorts of relative pitch. So, for example, we can talk about relative pitch between different scale degrees, not always referring back to the tonic. And we can also think about relative pitch relating to specific chord tones. So thinking about some of the really landmark important notes in a scale as being very stable and very consonant notes that create a chord sound and are particularly useful when improvising through chord changes. I'll give you an example of thinking about relative pitch between scale degrees rather than always referring back to the tonic. Here's a musical idea. Now I've played a series of 7 notes there. 7 notes. Okay. One way that we looked at in the previous video of trying to identify the intervals in that particular passage would be by figuring out, always referring back to the tonic, what each of those notes would be. Now, in this particular example, I think there's actually some simpler patterns that can be observed by looking for relationships inside that particular melody. So let me play it for you again. 7 notes. Now, inside of that, I'm looking for some meaning to help me identify the intervals that I'm working with without having to calculate 6 different intervals. I've started on the tonic, and then there's 6 notes that follow that. Okay, now if I play those notes in a slightly different order, I can start to find some other hidden meaning. Let me play you this idea. That's those same 7 notes, but I've reorganized them because I've noticed that hidden in that sort of rocking motion where I ascend, descend, ascend, descend, ascend, and I'm bouncing around these large intervals, there's actually a lot of very close neighboring notes that are just interspersed and separated by these large intervals. So the lower 3 notes of the melody are, and the upper 4 notes of the melody are. So I'm not going 1, 2, 1, 3 to get the first 3 degrees of that scale. I'm actually just thinking 1, 2, 3, straight into 3. It's a scalar passage. And then when I'm leaping up to the 5th degree, 1, 5, I am using relative pitch in relation to the tonic to establish that interval there. But after that point, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm not going back to the tonic every time. 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7, 1, 8. That's really unnecessary to do that. So now let's actually hear the original melody again and see if we can identify the hidden melody that I've just identified and how it plays out in that passage. I'll play you the hidden melody again. Here's the original one more time. Let's see if we can hear it. Okay, so that's the idea of using the relationships between scale degrees rather than the relationship always coming back to the tonic and having sometimes to do with very large intervals. We can keep our intervals really small that way, and I find that it creates more use of stepwise motion, which is very small intervals going to the neighboring notes in the scale, less margin for error, more chance of success. That's always a winner. Okay, the second idea I'd like to talk about is using relative pitch in relation to chord tones, and that's the sort of the sound of working with the sound of a chord. Let me play you a major triad. 1, 3, 5. That's a really important sound to be thinking about when you have a major sound, when you're improvising on a major chord. You don't have to play those notes, but they're the notes that are the foundation of the sound that you're improvising against. Sometimes it might be useful to specifically target relationships with those chord tones rather than looking for every single note of the scale as a relationship. There might be certain melodic passages that really heavily revolve around those chord tones. So you might find that there's some neighbor tones or some passing notes between them. Let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, sounds like a major arpeggio to start with. And I'm expecting, to be honest, when I hear that sound to some extent, I'm expecting next to hear. But I don't hear that. Not in this example anyway. Let me play you what I played one more time so you can hear it. Okay, Okay, so this is just a phrase that I've improvised for this example. 1, 3, something, 5. There's my 5. It happens after that other note. 1, 3, 5. So the melody is 1, 3, something, 5. Okay, so I now have, out of the 4 different notes that happen in this melody, a couple of them are repeated. There's 4 different notes. I have 3 out of 4, and I need to figure out what one of them is. So to do that, I'm going to use that strong knowledge that I have of I can hear the sound of the 5, and there's a note that happens before that. So I'm looking for the first note there. 5 is the second note, and I'm looking for the first note. So now I can hear that that's just the neighboring scale degree. It's above 5, so that's going to be 6. 1, 3, 6, 5, 6, 5. Okay, so that's an example of thinking about specifically beyond just any old scale degree as a reference point, but specifically the chord tones and how you might use relative pitch to your advantage. Again, thinking about trying to relate to as small an interval as possible to increase the accuracy of the ideas that you're hearing and how you interpret them. Okay, so we've talked about relative pitch in relation to the tonic, relative pitch between different scale degrees, and relative pitch in relation to some specific chord tones. So far, everything that we've talked about has been diatonic, which means in the key center, and there have been no chromatic notes. We can play around with this idea and develop our relative pitch within a major scale until we're blue in the face, but at a certain point, to get the color that we associate with a jazz melody, we're going to need to introduce some level of chromaticism. I'd like to show a couple of exercises or ideas that you could work on to help you not only incorporate some of this chromaticism into the musical ideas you have in your vocabulary, but also to help you hear these ideas in the first place if, for example, they don't occur to you naturally, and you can expand on your vocabulary in that way. All right, the first approach that I'd like to show you is working on approach notes on a major triad. Now, this for those of you that are playing along at home, I'm playing on a concert E-flat major triad, if you want to try playing along with me or playing after me. I'm going to play a chromatic approach below each of the chord tones of the major triad. It's going to sound like this. Now, for some of you, that might sound very normal. For some of you, that might sound really strange. That's okay. Either way is fine. Let me just play you the foundation of that idea and then explain how those approach notes work in relation. Is the major triad, and then each of those notes is going to have a chromatic note, or you might prefer a semitone, or you might prefer to call it a half step. Any and all of these words work, and it doesn't matter what you call them. I encourage you to learn all of these terms because when you speak with different musicians, everyone's going to use different language for this stuff, and it will help you just feel comfortable moving between the different terms and understanding that ultimately we're talking about the same thing. Okay, so each of those chord tones is going to have a semitone approach below it. So the target note in each case is the second note out of each pair. And the approach note is the first note out of each pair. The approach notes don't make sense on their own. They only exist because they have somewhere to go, the target notes, okay? The target notes are the notes of the triad, okay? So I would encourage you to practice that sound and think about maybe even singing it. Da 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 da. So there's different ways that you could name those notes, but perhaps just to simplify this sort of thing, perhaps you could just try approach the 1, approach the 3, approach 5. There's no real formal system for how to do this. You can come up with your own way, or you can use that way, and anything is fine. What is important is that 1, 3, and 5, that's not negotiable for this exercise. They are called 1, 3, and 5. There's different ways that you could name the other notes, but it doesn't matter. Make sure you learn the sound of that, and then make sure you try playing it on your instrument as well. So you'll need to understand it from the sound level, I would suggest first, then perhaps the theoretical level of understanding what those notes would be in relation to different major triads. You might try practicing that through 12 keys. And then on your instrument, to be able to technically play that in 12 keys. There's kind of 3 layers to understanding how to do that. Okay, that's one exercise. Another exercise that I'd like to suggest that you try is perhaps trying some approach notes from above the chord tones. Let's try having some diatonic approach notes this time from above each chord tone. Again, there's going to be 1, 3, and 5 as the target notes. Okay? And preceding each of those will be an approach note. This time it's going to be a scale degree above each of those notes. So it's going to sound like this. Okay? Again, for playing that or to learn that sound, there's kind of 3 levels to it. Learn the sound of it. I would suggest that means make sure that you know how to sing it and that you can feel that you know exactly the sound you're trying to produce in your ear and you can sing it and it's accurate. Then understanding how what notes would be involved in doing that through 12 keys. And then the third layer is actually being able to technically play that on your instrument to make sure that you know the fingering for the relative notes, to make sure that you know your chromatic scale, so you on your instrument, so that you have all the fingerings, or if you're a guitarist or a bassist, the appropriate position to play that, or the form to play that if you're a guitarist on your instrument. Thanks for watching the video today. I hope you got something out of it. And try to keep an ear out for some of these melodic devices that we talked about today around approach tones, chromatic approach tones below, scalar approach tones from above, in some of the melodies that you already play and listen to. To finish off with today, I'm going to improvise a little bit, expanding on some of the concepts that we explored in the video.